Welcome to the next installment of the Train Vicar. Well, today I'm continuing the series on the history of passenger trains in New Zealand, and I'm looking at the period from 1955 to 1968. In many regards, that's the classical period of New Zealand railways, and if you look at some of the pictorial books of the railways in New Zealand, you will find pictures from that period, 1955, probably to around 1970. That is the time when there were still steam locomotives in New Zealand, but also along with some diesel and rail cars. So by 1968, it was the end of an era, so to say, even though steam continued on in some places in minor form until 1971. This was also a time when several sections of railway lines were closed, often accompanied by large protests of the local population. Some of the changes on the railways were explored quite well in a film clip from 1957 entitled Our Changing Railways. This was a part of the pictorial parade which was normally played in cinemas before the main feature film. So let's have a look at what they saw happening in the railways in the 1950s.
Rolling out of the Dunedin sheds comes New Zealand's latest steam locomotive, the latest and the last. She was built in '56, and we'll make no more like her, for the days of steam are passing. For many years yet, young boys and old boys will see the big steam engines leaving their trails of smoke behind them, puffing and puffing out history with every turn of their wheels. Railcars are the thing today. Except on the main trunk lines of both islands, they've replaced the passenger expresses. With their speed and quick acceleration, they beetle over the steep grades and twisting tracks of our railways. On 9 services from Auckland to the west coast, arrival times for passengers are well ahead of the old-time schedules.
Six standard rail cars were introduced in the North Island in the late 1930s. These were built by New Zealand Rail in their own workshops. They seated 52 passengers. In the South Island, 9 rail cars were introduced from 1940 to 1942, and they were built by the Vulcan Foundry in England. These rail cars seated 50 passengers. These rail cars proved to be quite a success, so more rail cars were ordered after the Second World War, and the first one arrived in 1955.
In the midst of Old Faithfuls, the newcomer hops. Powered by 2 Italian-made diesels, the 88-seater's built for speed and safety with articulated joints. What's articulation? He's got his finger on it now. Mr. McAlpine looks over the controls. Rail cars will ensure an 11-hour link between Auckland and the South Island ferry service. Later, South Island will use them in a big way too.
A total of 35 of these articulated rail cars were put in service from 1955 to 1957. They were built by Drewry in England with engines from Fiat in Italy. They seated 88 passengers, and as such were the ideal size for New Zealand conditions at the time. These rail cars were quite fast and improved passenger comfort quite a bit. As they were put in service, passenger numbers rebounded throughout New Zealand because the railways now offered fast, convenient, frequent services to the public. So that was the ideal outcome for New Zealand railways. But there were a few problems. First of all, the new Drewry railcars, or sometimes called Fiat railcars, were a mechanical failure. First of all, the bodywork wasn't good enough. So the metalwork had corroded in the toilets, the luggage and guards compartment needed modifications, and the driver's cabs leaked in the rain. Also, the motors overheated. They actually sparked line side fires. And also, the crankcases began to break so that there were frequent failures of these rail cars and they often could not run, and a few even burned out. To keep up with maintenance, the mileage of these rail cars had to be reduced drastically, so the schedules had to be cut back. Also, after the experience with these rail cars, plans to buy more rail cars were put on hold because the experience with these new rail cars, the Fiats or Drurys or 88 seaters, whatever you would call them, was quite bad. So there was no political will to invest in more rail cars to have more services around the country. Another problem was that at this time, the management of New Zealand Rail gave a lot more prominence to freight transport. Passenger trains were often an inconvenience, and they were scheduled at times around the freight trains rather than when people needed or wanted to go. So that decreased passenger traffic even more. There were fewer services and at bad times. Also, some of the lines weren't maintained as well as they could, so some passengers complained about swaying within the rail cars as they traveled. More and more services were replaced by railways road services, that is, by buses, and fewer passenger trains were operating. In the late 1960s, there were plans to replace the engines of these rail cars or to possibly even buy new rail cars. And so when the railway minister brought that to cabinet, Treasury at that point argued vehemently against it. And as a result, no new engines or rail cars were ordered. So in 1967, 1968, a lot of the rail car services were cancelled throughout the country. This was really the end of the passenger railway covering all of New Zealand. Trains continued, but mainly on the main lines, but not so much for local needs or with local connections, and the trains were less frequent as well. Some of the rail cars soldiered on until 1976, but the overall coverage service that the rail cars had provided was over by 1968. In 1968, also steam in the North Island ceased, so it is really the end of an era. To this day, the topic of the railcars brings up quite a bit of emotion. There are some people who say that railcars have been tried in New Zealand and they did not work. Others say they have been tried and initially they worked, but there were issues with the railcars and with management that meant that they then could not provide the service that they were really destined to provide. So there are different views of the history of these railcars. In a sense, it reminded me a little bit about this book here, the Bible. When I began this series, I said a lot of the Bible is about the history. Now, there was one period in the time of Israel that was debated quite a bit. It was the exile after Jerusalem was destroyed and the people had to go to Babylon. Few of the people seem to say that, God was not with them, as was obvious that their main city was destroyed and they had to be overcome by stronger gods. But others said, no, that's reading the history incorrectly. Rather, it was because of the unfaithfulness of the people of Israel and Judah in particular that God allowed the exile to happen, took them out of the land of Judah and brought them to Babylon, where the people were then changed to go back to the land of Judah or the area around Jerusalem later on. As you can see, there are different interpretations of history and some of the events are not very clear. But the Bible provides a perspective on how to read that particular history, and that then also relates to God's interactions with us to this very day. Whether I can draw such conclusions out of the history of railcars in New Zealand is another question, but they were an interesting chapter in New Zealand's history of passenger rail.
In the land down under, where the winds blow free, lies a tale of railways, a turbulent history. Since 1863, they've rolled on the tracks, moving people and goods, never looking back. They built this country, connected it all, provided the lifeline for both big and small. But short-sightedness and self-interest prevail. Railways not fully developed, potential derail. Steel tracks